Good afternoon, good evening, everyone, where you're calling in from. We're going to wait a couple more minutes to get started. I can see that people are starting to join, and welcome. And like I said, we're going to wait a couple more minutes to get going, but feel free to introduce yourself if you'd like, no pressure if you don't want to. And we'll obviously introduce ourselves in a few minutes as well. So just wanted to welcome everyone and let you know that we're going to get going in a few minutes.
So when did you want to go for a walk?
One, Bobby.
Hi, everyone. I can see people are starting to introduce themselves and chat in the chat box. That is so great. I think I can see we have about maybe 10 people that have joined. Other people are still joining. I think I'll give it one more minute before we kick off. But again, please feel free to introduce yourself, come off mute while we wait. If you'd like, introduce yourself in the chat box, chat to each other while we wait, but no pressure. We'll get going in one more minute. All right, let's get started. I know that we'll probably have a couple of participants trickle in while we get going, but the first part will just be an introduction, and we'll go through a few housekeeping things to make sure everyone is aware of what we're going to be doing and how this workshop will be run. I just want to say good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, depending on where you're calling in from. It's my morning, I'm in San Francisco. Welcome to our session on the role of technology in a human rights and climate resilient future. Don't worry, we'll go through what that means. It might be a lot in a sentence, if that is a sentence. I'm joined by my colleague Hannah Darton, who I'll let introduce herself in a few minutes, but my name is Samantha Harris. My pronouns are she, her. I'm an associate director in the BSR Business for Social Responsibility San Francisco office. Business for Social Responsibility, if you don't know us, we are a global nonprofit and a member network that partners and works with businesses, including Mozilla, to create a more just and sustainable world. I, as I said, am an associate director in the San Francisco office. I'm also our global lead for climate justice, and super excited to have you all here. I'm going to hand it over to Hannah to introduce herself now, and then we'll get going.
Hello, everyone, and great to have you here with us today. My name is Hannah Darton. Pronouns are she, her, and I'm an associate director of ethics, technology, and human rights here in the San Francisco office with SAM, and really looking forward to diving into this topic with you all today.
Okay, so just a quick run through of our agenda and how this is going to work. We're going to give a quick introduction in a minute, and we are not able to do the poll exercise, so I'm sorry for that, but also we have a few other things that, a few other ways to sort of get information from you instead of doing the poll. We'll go through what is this human rights and climate change? What does that even mean? What does that look like? We'll give a quick introduction about that. How we can plan for the future for this lens, and then we'll do an interactive exercise and breakout groups so all of you can participate and chat with each other and us. We'll give a quick share back with the group on those breakout groups, and then we'll wrap it up. Let me bring us to some housekeeping, just so you know, and this would have been on the website sort of registration page. The workshop is being recorded, and this is just for the potential opportunities for others to learn that couldn't make it for a number of other reasons. This workshop is really only designed to be with a limited amount of people, and so we wanted to make sure that we're able to share what we talk about. So a couple of different things. If this isn't your vibe, you don't want to be recorded, that is totally fine. There are a couple of ways you can sort of avoid that and still participate. You can write in the chat function. You can engage through the chat function. That won't be saved. You can turn off your video if you'd like. That won't be recorded. The breakout group also won't be recorded, so you can feel free to participate freely in the breakout groups without being recorded or anything. Nobody's spying on you or anything like that. So, so really, you know, we encourage you to stay if you'd like and engage in these other ways if you don't want to be recorded. We want to encourage you to participate however you feel comfortable. So if you want to have your video on, that is great. If you don't, that's also great. I'm going to keep my video on and just so you can see me. I like to engage that way, but again, that's really up to you. We want to offer, you know, other ways to engage in the chat. Like I said, if you want to raise your hand, use the raise hand function. If you want to come in verbally, that's also great. If you at a good time, obviously, when someone's not speaking, if you want to just come in, unmute yourself and speak, we are totally open to that. Try to maybe keep yourself on mute if you have noise in your background, just so it doesn't interrupt others when they're speaking. But really, please do feel free to participate and engage in the way that makes you feel comfortable. And unfortunately, I don't think we'll have time to do full introductions with everyone on this in the session, but please do introduce yourself however you'd like to do that. If you want to introduce yourself to the chat function now, let us know where you're dialing in from. Let us know your pronouns. Let us know anything else that you'd like to share. Maybe what hat you're wearing today. If you're an academic or if you're just an advocate and you're here to learn, just let us know. We'd love to know. That was really what the poll was about. Like, why are you here? So please do feel free to put that in the chat. And then, of course, if you do come in and speak verbally, we'd also love for you to introduce yourself then and engage in that way. So I think that's it. I think let me just pause and make sure if anybody has any questions or any concerns that we can raise those now. Otherwise, I'm going to get going.
I don't think you're recording yet.
Okay, well, let's go ahead
Recording
and record.
in progress.
Well, good. You missed all the the bad introductory, like annoying, not very interesting stuff. So we are recording now. Again, if you don't feel comfortable with that, just let us know, or to go ahead and drop off, or also just use the chat function and engage in the way that makes you feel comfortable. All right, let's get started. We only have an hour, so. First of all, what are we talking about? What is this human rights and climate change thing? We want to make sure that we provide you with a bit of background to be able to engage in this conversation. Obviously, we can't get into every single detail about this. This is a very huge pillar of work and a big community of people that work on this, so we can't go into all the details, but just enough to have an engaging conversation. And so hopefully that's what we leave you with, but please do feel free to ask questions throughout the chat or in the chat function. I'm also going to pause after this if you want to come in verbally, and we can try to address those questions as well. So when we think about climate change and human rights, fundamentally what we mean is the unequal or inequitable impact on people. And so you can see a couple of quotes here on the screen. As Ban Ki-moon, he was a former UN Secretary General, said, "The poorest and the most vulnerable, those who have done the least to contribute to climate change, are feeling the impacts the most today. It's inequitable, it's unfair, and those are the main sort of key messages that I want you to take today from this." You can also see that in 2008, which is not recent, so this has been around for quite some time, that the UN Human Rights Council made a resolution focused on the human rights impacts from climate change, noting that it poses both a short and a long-term threat to people and communities around the world and can have implications for reaching the full enjoyment of human rights. These are related to jobs, livelihoods, access to resources, access to food and water, health, mobility, and even homes. And we've been seeing this happen for some time now, and we're seeing it happen more and more, but action remains minimal, unfortunately. So what we've been working on is really trying to scale up action and build awareness about this intersection so we can move the community to act on this. We also know that without looking at these two together, we can't solve one crisis without solving the other. So climate change really does threaten to undo the last 50 years of progress and development in global health and poverty reduction. And we know that in order to curb global emissions to a safe, and I'll get into that in a bit, a safe scale, it will require ambitious action and societal transformation. So one that really involves bringing society and people along. So really another key message there around like making sure that when we're looking at this, we know that we need to move on one. We need to solve the climate crisis in order to really address poverty reduction and vice versa. So that's just another key message there. So why is this happening? And I want to try to not add too much jargon and lingo. Basically, we have rising global temperatures, which are creating a series of climate impacts. And this is often increasing in numbers and severity. And so these could look like extreme weather events like hurricanes and storms, floods or droughts, sea level rise in the much longer term, and changes in vector-borne diseases like malaria, Zika, and others, of course. And these impacts are disproportionately affecting different groups and communities around the globe. This looks different across the globe. This looks different in countries. It looks different in regions. It also can look different within a community itself. So many nuances there. And some of the groups are listed here as an example, but this is certainly, it doesn't capture all of the populations, all of the people that will be disproportionately affected. But some that we want to, I guess, bring to you for this conversation today is groups around gender impacts or women, BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color populations, people with disabilities, elderly, and children. And I've already mentioned this on the last slide, but that this can really affect the human rights. And here we have it laid out where it's, these are the human rights that are most, that we see most commonly reflected, like access to jobs, health, livelihoods, and even access to food and water, like I had mentioned. I want to give you a few stats, not too many, but even if we meet some of the goals that we're expected to meet, like some of you might have heard about the Paris Agreement, and that really does say that we need to reach, keep warming within levels of 1.5 degrees Celsius. For example, in the US, 100 to 400 million people could be at risk of hunger, and 1 to 2 billion people may not even be, may no longer have access to adequate water. So that's even if we reach the goals that we're really striving to reach. And we could see climate change resulting in global crop losses in agriculture of 30% by 2080, which seems like a long way away and doesn't seem like a lot, but 30% of agricultural crops is actually quite a big number that we could see lost. And so what we'll also potentially be seeing is really large scale movements of people, both internally and across borders, creating climate refugees, or people that have had to move because of climate impacts and flee their homes to different countries even. So this looks, again, different everywhere you go. A couple of nuances I want to flag. For example, in the US, race and income are the salient factors where we see BIPOC populations most affected because of historically having less access to resources. One example is Hurricane Katrina, where we really saw this come to light in 2005, where we saw mostly women, Black women and children in low-income communities that were most affected. And one example is really in South Asia, we see gender and income as the salient factors because of the socioeconomic and cultural barriers that women face in some of those countries, like not being allowed to leave their house without a male guardian, for example, or not being allowed to learn how to swim. So in the event of an emergency or a flood, they actually cannot leave their homes. So those are just a few of the nuances. There are many. One more slide just to give you a sense of some of the themes that we're seeing arise, because this can be both from the physical impacts of climate change, which I've already explained, and also from the solutions that we're putting forward. So we have to be careful about how we're moving away from certain technologies and fossil fuels that we know we need to transition away from, but really ensure that we're bringing those communities with us. And so if there are, communities that are dependent on fossil fuels for their livelihoods, workers that are dependent, we need to make sure that we're helping them transition from jobs like coal mining, for example, or fossil fuel jobs into new jobs, or have social protection measures that can help them in other ways. This is referred to as the just transition. Another element that we're also seeing, we're seeing human rights allegations on the other side of the transition to renewable energy, which we know is something that we need, and it's necessary in order to curb emissions, and they are the key solutions to reducing emissions, but we need to make sure that they're also being done in a way that protects human rights and provide good working conditions and not taking land from communities, et cetera. So lots of nuances there, but those are some of the themes that I want you to think about when we start the workshops later. And last slide, and then I'm going to hand it over to Hannah, is just to describe a few of the other terms that we're seeing that are associated with this. And so one is really this climate apartheid, which is something that Philip Alston, who was a UN Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights in 2019, said, but really is just looking at the fact that those with resources, the wealthy, are able to escape the impacts of climate change, and those that aren't wealthy, don't have the resources, can't, and they end up suffering and feeling the brunt of everything. So that's one of the terms that we're seeing, and it's also really, I guess, a sister term of climate justice. So many of you may have seen quite a lot around climate justice over the last year, and that's really ensuring that equity is placed at the heart of climate solutions. So making sure, again, that those that are most affected by climate change, by environmental problems, are put at the center of either responding to how climate impacts are affecting them, or at the center of those solutions that we're putting forward. So let me stop here. Let me see if there are any quick clarifying questions. I will also go to the chat and try to answer as much as I can. And then I'll hand it over to Hannah, who will talk us through some of what this looks like in the future and how we're starting to solve this and think about this.
Great, thanks so much, Sam. And we can move to the next slide then.
Sure.
Great, so as you all know, the intersection between human rights and climate is not new. This is something, as Sam mentioned, that has been in existence for years and years. However, really it's coming into focus now. Companies, civil society actors are starting to look at the implications on human rights of climate change and trying to address it with a streamlined approach that tackles both climate impacts and human rights impacts together. But what we're not necessarily doing is taking a real futures lens to it, thinking through how these impacts could intersect in the years to come. And that's what we want to talk about a little bit today, is how we can apply futures thinking to some of these different kind of implications that are going to be arising. Next slide. So the first thing to think through is that disruption is the new norm. The world around us is changing more rapidly than ever before, with massive implications for how we consider the role of business, civil society, in creating a just and sustainable world. The context for society, ethics, human rights, and technology is radically different than it was even a decade ago, as evidenced by the accelerating energy transition, highly disruptive technologies such as artificial intelligence, and increasing geopolitical volatility and new expectations for actors within the system. Businesses, organizations that fail to adapt quickly to changing conditions are at risk of being swept aside. So how do we think about this? Next slide, Sam. Our brains evolved to help us think about short-term survival needs. We have hardwired cognitive biases that make it difficult for us to think effectively about complex global issues and unpredictable change. We frequently respond to uncertain future possibilities with denial, so oversimplification or false confidence about certain elements, or with paralysis, so planning for everything or a wait and see approach. Our business tools, our civil society tools rely too much on extrapolation from the past and outmoded mental models. Yet effective leaders need more than ever to be able to think about complex, unpredictable change and to make wise strategic decisions in the face of uncertainty. Let's look at one thing we've seen in the past on the next slide, Sam. This is where futures comes in. Companies have started attempting to predict futures using forecasts. However, forecasts do have their limits. This graph that you'll see here is from the International Energy Agency, the World Energy Outlook, with predictions for the future of solar and renewables market. But as we see here in the colored lines, year after year, their forecasts have been wrong. That black line going straight up is what's actually happened in that market. Forecasts are a useful tool for well-defined phenomena and over a short time horizon, but they're less effective when considering complex phenomena or over long-term horizons, or when based on highly incomplete and data and unknowns. Some emergent phenomena are too complex or too new to be meaningfully forecast. We need a new way to be thinking about these issues. And that's where futures comes in, or futures thinking, as we call it here. This is also known as strategic foresight. And Sam, we can move to the next slide. Futures thinking is a structured approach to exploring the forces that shape the future. This includes identifying and understanding emerging issues that may disrupt current trends and considering multiple future scenarios to improve decision-making in the face of future uncertainty. It's not focused on predictions, but rather on expanding our field of vision, challenging our assumptions about the future, and identifying blind spots, thereby improving our capacity to adapt and to steer change. Next slide. So today we want to pilot one way of using futures thinking to help consider the wide range of future possibilities and help us prepare for those future eventualities. On the next slide, we'll see that exercise today. So it's called Futures Wheels. Would love to hear in the chat if anyone's used these before. But really, Futures Wheels are a way to map the possible cascading impacts of an event or development. You start with a plausible future development, or what we're going to call a prompt. And the futures wheel is used to consider potential first order, second order, and third order human rights implications of that development. It does not enable us to predict the future, but can help us anticipate plausible, important, and non-obvious future developments of relevance to climate and human rights. So if you go on the next slide, we're just going to show a quick example here. So here in the center, you can see the prompt that we're using within this hypothetical. So driverless cars are ubiquitous in all major cities. So what happens if that's a near-term reality? On the next slide, we can see that one of the first order impacts of that, we've included a few here. So private companies gain the right to drive in certain areas while others don't, thereby excluding certain populations. You have transport options for the elderly and disabled are increased, thereby allowing, increased mobility, increased access to employment and services in the community. Many different things resulting from in this first order category. Second order consequences, though, bring new considerations on our next slide here. So what results from this? New employment opportunities, as we mentioned, from increased mobility, but you also have vulnerable groups that might be edged out of the communities if they're not able to access these driverless cars, if they're not serving certain populations. And finally, we consider the third order impacts here in our next slide, thinking long-term what this could actually lead to. If you think about driverless cars, for example, you could actually have coalitions forming around the right to drive. You could have reduced emissions, but you could also have potential extremists using cars to drive bombs into the stadiums or sports facilities of the local community. Lots of things that can happen that you can then think through the trickle-on effects of those original actions. And that's what we're going to be doing today, is working through a few of those near-term potential realities at the intersection of human rights and climate. We're going to then extrapolate the first, second, and third order impacts, and then take a step back as a breakout group to think through the implications on business, civil society, and what that means for us today, and what actions we should start putting in place to advance positive outcomes and mitigate those negative adverse consequences that could come from some of these potential realities. So in a moment, we're going to break you out into a few different groups. Sam, if you could just jump forward another slide, I'd love to show what this looks like if we were in person. So if we were in person, and I wish we could be, we'd be having lots of different color sticky notes with us today. And we'd basically be working around this prompt in a group, putting sticky notes on a big whiteboard and working together. But today we're going to be working with Moreau, and you probably all have a link to it already in the invitation for the session, but maybe Sam can drop it in the chat as well. And what I'm going to do is just share my screen briefly so you can see what this Moreau board is going to look like before we actually move into your groups. So here we go. You should be able to see my screen. Sam, can you see it? Great. So I'm going to assume you guys can see my screen. This is what your Moreau board is going to look like today. So as you'll see here, you have your first order effects. You're going to be able to put sticky notes, draw, move, drop these on there to think through those first order implications of this near-term reality. Your seed or your prompt is here in the left-hand corner. So you'll be able to actually look at the prompt that you're going to be working through. It's also in your black circle here in the middle. And you'll be looking through the reflection prompts here as your group. So what happens as a result of the seed or previous order consequences? Who's impacted? What are the advantages and positive outcomes? And what are the disadvantages and potentially negative outcomes? You'll spend about 5 to 7 minutes on this first order consequences. Then you'll move to about 5 minutes on the second order consequences and about 5 minutes on the third order consequences. So 15 minutes total to fill out this circle in the center here before then moving on to a 10-minute discussion around the implications that businesses and civil society may see and what they can take as real actions to mitigate negative consequences and advance positive opportunities. Now, a couple things to know about Moreau. One, in the bottom right-hand corner, you can zoom in and out of the screen, so it makes it a little easier to see the whole thing, or you can zoom right into the center there to be able to put on your sticky notes. There's also can be cursors flying around, so you can see where everyone's participating. That's in the top right-hand corner here. You can either show collaborators cursors, or they'll show where everyone is on the screen, or just click and turn that off so you don't see everything whizzing around. And finally, just to make sure that you all know how to add these stickies here. So if you click on the screen itself, you'll see a little bar come up that'll help you add a sticky. You can just add a little shape here, or you can just click on a sticky, copy it, add directly, and make some notes right on the screen. If you have any questions, feel free to ask Samurai. We will be facilitating these sessions, but that gives you a little bit of an idea of how you'll actually be able to participate in the session. It allows for a little bit more engagement than perhaps just a normal webinar. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we are going to be moving you into these two groups where your facilitator will be able to walk you through what you'll be exploring for the topic today. Let me just
Anna, before you whiz us off into two breakout groups, let's pause and see if anybody has any questions. If you have any issues accessing the links, or anything we can help you troubleshoot. If you have any questions about the logistics or anything, do come in now, either through the chat or by voice. We can also answer any questions in the breakout groups as well. All right, and welcome to everyone. Thank you for sharing your, introducing yourself on the chat. It's been really great. I've been enjoying reading who's on. Lots of different climate activists, which makes me super excited. So yeah, so I'm gonna hand it over to Hannah again. I think she's gonna break us out. Is that correct?
Yes, so I'm gonna move everyone to your rooms
right.
now. We'll spend about 25 minutes in this exercise, then I'm going to zoom everyone back with about 5 minutes left in the session so we can share out the thinking from each group. And with that, you're going to be automatically whizzed into your group.
Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi, Keto.
I think I've seen you twice today. Or was it yesterday?
Yeah, it was today as well. Yeah, this morning.
Yeah.
So it sounds like we have some friends already on the line. That's great. Makes for workshops easier. And I see that, Josh, you have some guitars in the background, myself as well. We can start a band if we have extra time. But thanks so much, everyone, for joining today. first real quick kind of survey. Does everyone have access to Miro? Can you see the screen? Got some thumbs up? Great. Okay, well then I'm not going to share my screen. I'm going to keep this camera open so we can see each other. And we are going to move into group 1. So if you're familiar with Miro, you can click on that first frame there. It should just say Futures Wheel and Discussion Group 1 right at the top. And with that, we're just going to take a quick minute. What I'd love for everyone to do is to take a look at that left-hand prompt and just take 2 minutes by yourself to kind of think through, okay, if this is the reality of today, so intrusive electronic surveillance and individual tracking measures that have been put in place to combat COVID-19 have also proven effective in managing climate-driven disruptions, and many countries have kept using them despite privacy infringements. If this is the near-term reality, what could be a possible near-term kind of first-order impacts of that be? I'm going to ask you just to reflect, give it 60 seconds, 2 minutes, and then we're going to come back and start populating the screen with a few sticky notes. Okay, hopefully everyone's gotten a chance to wrap your brain around this a little bit. I'd love to hear what you guys are thinking. Feel free to add a sticky note, write things down in the middle here, or I can take the notes if you don't feel like typing, that's fine too. But what are you guys thinking is the first order impacts of this new reality? Widespread surveillance, tracking climate disruptions and people. Borja, I'm sorry if I pronounced that wrong, but I see you smiling. You look like you're thinking of a couple. Do you want to jump in for us?
I'm not specifically, no, sorry. Not just yet.
Okay, that sounds good. Anyone else got some early ideas?
Oh, I just wrote down, I was literally trying to write down kind of like tracking and following people regardless of their consent, which I was about to write.
Yeah, keep going. That's a great one. And I think, Ian, that also brings up, what do we think about public and private spaces? How much is this going to be omnipresent versus, you know, perhaps only in certain locations? Do you think this will be everywhere? Do you think it's only going to be in certain areas? Are the lines between private and public becoming a little fuzzier with this type of surveillance?
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. It's a really good point. Kind of, there'll be no public spaces per se, because you know, everything will be now one type of area, and that's it.
So I'm just adding that a little bit here.
Maybe also a question of who actually owns the data. So I mean, obviously a lot of data is generated with the surveillance, and then so who is actually going to own it, and who has the right to manipulate the data and change it or delete it or whatever?
One of the things that comes to mind actually is more a question than an actual suggestion, which is we're saying that, you know, intrusive surveillance and tracking techniques are being used to manage disruption. Are we thinking they're being used to influence behavior? Are we thinking they're simply being used in an observing capacity? Are we thinking there's a combination of both? Yeah.
And
surely,
I think that's, oh, go ahead, sorry.
I'll say surely by being observed, your behavior changes.
And that's always a big question of behavioral practices when you're actually being surveyed. Do you have full autonomy of your person if you know you're being watched? What's your individual agency look like, and how does that change? So I think, Borja, that might be a really good question is, are all of those potential options that you just listed possible? Perhaps depending on the rule of law of the country where this is deployed, that could change. You know, you might have ones that are just kind of gently monitoring to make sure that emissions are only going so high, but in another instance, you might have individual tracking to see exactly how much you as an individual are producing. Your practices, are you taking an Uber every day? Are you walking to work? Are you, what are the penalizations that perhaps come out of that as well, or the ramifications of your actions? So if someone
is there feedback being targeted directly at individuals? For instance, with like COVID tracking, where people were talking, oh, like, let's like build some kind of tracking system that gives people notifications on their phone based on stuff being noticed about their, like immediate environments. Or is the feedback only happening at like much larger level? Here's what's going on at scale.
Yeah, let's add that in too. That's a good one.
Sorry, I just kind of sorry, I was like joined late, but would some of those be more second order effects?
Some of them might be,
yeah.
But I think that part of this gets a little bit gray in first to second order, and I think it's all right to write them down when they're kind of coming to you.
Yeah.
Because I do think that if you're seeing tracking, the immediate next step you might see is that you're getting feedback loops from that tracking. You're getting that data fed back to you, so you better understand your individual behavior. But you could also see that if the tracking is a little bit slow, that could be further down the line if there's other questions that come first. So it might be a little context specific on how the future manifests. So we've seen some negatives here. We've seen some positives too. So around, being able to understand your individual behaviors, but what are some positives of this that we might see in terms of climate change? So might this help actually us understand how individuals are committing to different actions, or if countries are being better than others and help kind of incentivize action? What do you think are some of the positives here?
Easier to develop targeted solutions. No, I mean, if you know what you're solving for, according to the behavior of the people or your clients, so to speak, then it might be easier to solve for that.
Definitely. And feel free to keep adding to this first order, but I think I'm already seeing some blue stickies starting to think through the second order. Let's move to that second order. As Ian was saying, a lot of times they do kind of mesh together a little bit. So we have some good, easier to develop targeted solutions. We have tracking of people, regardless of if they've consented or not. We have questions around who owns the data. What could all of this lead to? And let's start perhaps first with tracking and following people regardless of consent. I'm a human rights person, so this is one I really pay a lot of attention to. What might this do to different marginalized communities, different vulnerable populations? All of a sudden we have information on all LGBTQ populations in some parts of Africa where it's illegal, So what does that look like now that we have this data?
Well, it will expose people that may not necessarily want to be exposed. And it takes away the freedom to self-identify.
What are some other implications here?
There's also potential to generalize and, I don't know, say, for instance, that a certain group, if, sometimes data is skewed towards a certain thing, and it could result in certain groups being identified as that certain thing, even though that's not, that's not the reality. So it exacerbates, I guess, biases against certain groups.
And I guess also prosecution by the state.
Prosecution or even violence, depending, right? If there's a
Indeed,
rule of law,
yes.
people might decide to just take their own actions.
Indeed, yeah. I may not necessarily be from the state. Completely agree, yeah.
And I think there's some good questions here around, carbon tax on individuals, who owns the data, what are some other second order impacts we might see from these?
Someone put in, I don't know, yeah, low income groups impacted disproportionately by carbon taxes. That's a really good one.
Mm-hmm. And you could see that driving home, maybe this is the third order impact a little bit, I'm getting ahead of myself, but that could drive even a bigger divide between different social classes or socioeconomic classes. So people all of a sudden then can't be able to access education. Maybe that one of that could also interrelate with the fact that people don't want to be tracked. So they're hiding and then no longer accessing public services. One thing I haven't seen here is, as well as, we are talking about this electronic surveillance and tracking now being used in certain areas, but we could imagine where not all areas are being surveyed, right? So we might have certain countries unable to really set up the infrastructure needed to do this tracking. So you could have also a data divide where certain countries have this insider kind of understanding of how their actions are affecting climate, but others don't. And so they have no data, no solutions, therefore, that are really applicable to their context, and huge differences in then viable climate solutions in different areas. Does that resonate with people as well?
I mean, I think I kind of disagree with that. I mean,
great.
I think it's true. It's true for I think it's true for the global north. Global north, as in like marginalized people and not marginalized people, but I think across north south, in with respect to like people understanding, how like climate change works, how their actions impact the environment. I think there's maybe a greater understanding of how our individual actions from the global south could impact the environment in which we live in, I think, in my opinion.
So you're saying, sorry, that which side would have a greater understanding?
I think generally, communities, indigenous communities or marginalized communities, in inverted commas, in the global south, have a different relationship to the environment, and so they have a greater understanding of how their actions could impact, could have an impact on climate change and the communities, how they basically their relation to the earth or the environment. I think it's more different, but on a global scale, I think it's we talk about like power hegemonies and like how if the more data is collected in the global north, for instance, it would come across, in like platforms like these, that certain groups are more knowledgeable on their, actions, but, the lack of data on the other side, not the lack of data from systems, global systems, would be interpreted as like lack of information, where it's not necessarily what is happening.
Right. There's still that information. It's just not being captured in the same way, right? It's a
exactly.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Let's make sure that's reflected in here, because I think that's a good call out as well, is these systems are capturing data in a very specific way, but it's not necessarily reflective of the understanding of all populations of how their actions are engaging with climate change. And I think we're kind of moving out. I see a couple third order impacts here. I think a mental health epidemic from people never having their own space to think. That's a really good one. And it's something we think about here a lot, Sam and I and our team, about individual autonomy and identity. How do actual societal behavioral practices completely change? You could see kids, being trained to completely kind of eliminate all emotions, at least physical manifestations of emotions, because they know they're always being surveyed or tracked, right? And so how does that change society? How does that change mental health? How does that change our understanding and ability to interrelate with one another? There's a lot going on here, and it's getting a little sci-fi. You can imagine if everyone was very stoic all the time. But I swear that this is an exercise the writers of Black Mirror use in some of their kind of screenwriting. So let's push ourselves a little bit here. What else is kind of weird, large scale, societal impacts like that we could see from some of these first and second order impacts that we've created?
Well, maybe we should also think about power, and
Mm-hmm.
you know how that affects, or who holds, who gets in a position of power by either having access to data or having the necessary resources versus either individuals or countries or regions that may not necessarily have those resources.
And Kito, it sounded like you were kind of getting to some of the questions around power as well. And so those,
Mm-hmm.
And power, how it's interpreted too. What is power? What are the definitions?
Yeah. But I'm also thinking, like, if you collect data on an individual scale, I mean, later on, who determines, based on who owns the data? There've been questions about, who owns the data, who has the right to manipulate it. It's also like, who later on, at some point, there will be like key indicators of, what is positive change or what we should be looking at. So carbon tax, for instance, or like just certain practices that we do on a individual level or like on an industrial level, and those will be indicators where in other regions perhaps it's different. For instance, I mean, an example would be maybe, I'm from Namibia, and I think generally groups that are defined as marginalized or indigenous, although like everyone is indigenous, I think, they have a very like a healthy relationship with like meat and like animals and so, but like on a global scale, it's like, oh, let's reduce the amount of meat that we eat, but it's not the same for everyone.
So almost different levers that are already like different points of leverage that these communities have identified for themselves and what they might be extending out in the future, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And in a moment, we're going to turn to implications, but any others that we want to make sure to jot down here? I see some good ones going up. Laws changing to reflect your history over your lifetime. Oof, yeah, that's a good one. Insurance going up for countries who don't collect this data. Also really good one. Class divide is worsened. I think we should add probably something of individual autonomy. I like the mental health one. Oh, thanks guys for getting in there with me. At least you're pretty techie. I've been on some groups before that we couldn't even get into Miro, so it was always a challenge. But in our last, let's see, I think we have about 7 or 8 minutes left together. So I'd love to start thinking about the implications. We've obviously brainstormed out. There's lots more that we could put down on this board. What are some of the positive, negative implications that we can start thinking about today? Putting actions in place or putting mechanisms in place to make sure some of these negative long-term consequences don't arise, and to ensure that some of these positive opportunities that are actually helping us identify some of the actions we should take can be put in place in advance now. I'd love to hear your thoughts on those.
I have one. I think more I think it'll be cool if like later on we have like data commons and like individual groups, like taking control of their data, finding their individual like context, and having a participatory like approach that like contextualized with their different like environments. So instead of having like one global like approach, it's like different approaches depending on the community.
Mm-hmm. I like it. Other responses to either that idea or other ideas that you'd like to throw in the mix?
Same kind of protections that we...
Go ahead.
I heard two at once. Go ahead. Ian, why don't you go for it?
Okay. I was going to say, I forgot what I was going to say now, but I think it's basically, I think that there should be, I I'm looking at the one about who's policing the data. I think that there could be something where you could see what data is being collected, not just on yourself, but also, there's like another, like almost like an agent that kind of like lets you know that the data is saying this about you, or they think this about you. Does that make sense? So it's like almost like you've got some kind of like third party who's giving you prompts about this is what if you do this action, then this is what the result will be, almost.
So individualized data to help you take individualized action, right?
Yeah, I think it's something like, so it's like you was like, maybe it was kind of like gives you like a risk score almost, but in real time, so that, I mean, it kind of sounds a little bit like negative, but also if it's under your control, then it could be positive, to at least have access to that data, rather than look at the data, but actually like, here's what the result will be of that based on the algorithms that are being used. Does that make sense?
If done in a rights respecting manner, where you have those privacy mechanisms, where you have your own data ownership and it's not necessarily visible to others, there could be really positive cases where you start seeing individual action.
Yeah.
Just as a quick anecdote too, one of the things we saw, the Nordics tried to create a blood drive years ago, and they couldn't figure out how to actually get people donating blood. There was no way, they couldn't do it. They were so short. And they ended up getting all these people together and finally found that if you tracked it and showed where your blood donation went and how it ended up in social good, like positive change. So a 5-year-old in need of a blood transfusion was able to live today because you gave blood. That data back to the individual donor changed, and now they're net exporter of blood donations, just because of that one simple tracking mechanism. And you could see how that could actually be the same here. This helped you reduce emissions by XYZ amount, right? So, and sorry, Borhan, I think you were jumping in there a while ago, and I rudely took up too much time.
Yeah, no, I was just going to mention, like, and it feels like, the more of, it's surprising, like, the range of different conversations in this space that, like, like keep emphasizing how much this is needed. But yeah, like, like having like regulatory framework that, for AI, that take a comprehensive look at human rights questions, democracy protection questions, rule of law questions is really central to resolving a challenge like this as well. And it's not just like, like a thing for, yeah, it is also like, like when it comes to these, like, like more targeted question about the intersection between surveillance technologies and the environment. So the kind of, like work that's coming out of, the Council of Europe is really interesting in that front for me.
Okay, so we've got a couple here. I've added the one that you just mentioned, kind of around considerations of the context in which these technologies are deployed. So considering rule of law, considering kind of the different governance and regulatory structures that are in place. Any others that we want to add here?
I'll say, I mean, one thing that we haven't added, or I don't think we've added, is, especially since we've mentioned the pandemic, is that there's some very easy determinations that can be made with the next pandemic. It's like, okay, well, we have this information, we know a little bit about. I mean, this is maybe the smart part, is that you have that data about people's patterns of tracking and stuff like that with tracking, but then also you have your data about your health and stuff like that, and then something pulls them both together. I'll say the agent again, excuse me, and will just let you know, this is, it's too risky to go outside right now, or don't do this because, the chances are that you will be infected, for example. So it was like, kind of like, yeah, I think the same about having access to that data, but also having access to your own personal data, and then something kind of like going, so you'll get less, hopefully get less people who are infected the next pandemic.
Yeah. So yeah, aggregated data combined with individualized data leads to
With personal data,
yeah.
Which is obviously a massive public health. That'd be really good for public health. That's the end result.
Yeah. Well, I think we're going to need to move back to the group. Would anyone like to help share out some of our findings here? I would love a partner in crime, although I am happy to help. Oh, everyone's looking away from the screen. I see it. Okay, how about I start things off and then you guys contribute? Does that sound good? Okay, perfect. I won't put anyone on the spot. Well, I'll see you guys back in the breakout room then. Let's see. Close all rooms.
Recording in progress.
Perfect. Great to see everyone made it back. We didn't lose anyone in cyberspace. We'll just wait for the others. In the meantime, I will start sharing my screen. Feel free to keep adding if anything comes to you.
Okay, I think my group is coming back. They're still continuing to put implications in the implication box. So
wonderful. Well, thanks so much, Sam. Great to see that almost everyone's making it back. Let's just move this board so it's not quite overlapping. We have about 5 minutes or a little less than 5 minutes left. So we just wanted to give a quick recap of some of the things we found. And so taking a look first at group 1, and then Sam will pass over to you for group 2. Feel free to have anyone that you selected to share out jump in. But there we go. Thank you for moving that. So our first prompt in the group 1 was thinking through intrusive electronic surveillance and individual tracking measures that have been put in place to combat COVID-19 and the pandemic has also proven effective in managing climate-driven disruptions. And many countries have now kept using them despite significant privacy infringements. So our group started thinking, of course, through the first, second, third order implications of this, and I can zoom in a little bit so you can see those. There we go. But basically, we started thinking through how this would actually impact different communities, how you could gamify climate-friendly activities, you would track and follow people regardless of their consent. There might be a carbon tax on individuals, a fuzziness between public and private spaces. They might become one and the same with this really comprehensive surveillance. And that could lead to many different things. So it could lead to actions and legislative or regulatory issues from the state, or even violence by the nation state in question. It could lead to questions around who's policing the data, who owns it. You could have certain communities that are being followed while others aren't. Authoritarian leaning countries may start to lead global climate change efforts because they now have the data to do so. But you also have low income groups impacted disproportionately by carbon tax and social pressures. Now this is moving. Let's see, we'll move it back. Boom, boom, boom. There we go. And inequality over data use could be seen as dangerous. So lots of different kinds of impacts here. In our third tier, we really started thinking of how this could actually centralize power in different areas. And the fact that tracking technology becoming the norm embeds certain social behaviors. So if you are being tracked, how do you respond as an individual? How do you think about your own autonomy? Maybe you start masking emotions because you don't necessarily want to be showing it to all these different tracking mechanisms. And insurance goes up for countries who aren't collecting this data, perhaps. Laws might change to reflect your history over your lifetime of your practices. And class divides are worsening. So those are just a few. We're seeing a lot of different kind of end outcomes here that resulted in quite a few implications. So there were a couple of great ones that came up. So thinking through data commons. What could individuals do to take control over the data? So we would create a commons so that many people were participating in how data was collected, shared, and used, having it be a global approach rather than country by country or siloed in different communities. We also thought that it could be helpful to have individualized data that helps you take individualized action. So if you control all of your data and then can take action on your climate impacts and really be able to help make personal change, but done in a privacy and rights respecting manner so that you have actual ownership of your data, it could actually be a positive outcome. We could start thinking through what that would look like today. We have a couple others here, but I want to make sure to give Sam the chance to really talk through her. So I guess I just passed to my group for a quick 30 seconds. Anything to add here that we missed or things you wanted to specifically call out?
I think, Hannah, because we're at time, unfortunately, we probably won't have time for me to recap, but why don't, let me also give the opportunity to my group to call out some of the examples. Otherwise, we can also invite everyone to look at the other Miro board or the other, topic that you didn't work on if you want to look at some of the things that we came up. But let me just quickly see if anybody in my group wants to come in for about 15 seconds. I don't want to keep people in case they have another session to go to. All right, and I see people shaking their heads. They're like, no. All right.
Well,
I think we can go ahead and close out.
Yeah, as a closing note, this is a really helpful exercise as a group, but it can be really helpful in teams if you want to get a little bit more concrete at your own organization, your own company, to help through, rather than just broad implications, the specific actions your team, department, or organization should take in relationship to some of these end outcomes and how you can create really resilient strategies that might be fruitful in any potential future environment. So we're always happy to speak through how this works. This was a really rapid example, but hope you had fun today. And thanks to everyone for joining.
And please do reach out with any other questions or if you want to continue the conversation. The Miro board, I believe, will stay up for a bit so you can continue working with it, playing with it, reviewing it. And we will figure out a way to send the deck around as well. It's been really great having you. And thanks so much for joining. As always, we never have enough time to do what we would like. So too bad we don't have another, hour to dive in. But this was really great. And thank you so much.
Thanks again.
Bye, everyone.